There was a time when American basketball didn't just lead the world, it defined it. Before the global explosion of the game, before international superstars and worldwide leagues, the United States stood alone at the center of basketball excellence. The arenas were louder, the rivalries were raw, and the talent was concentrated in a way that made the sport feel almost mythical. And in that era, when America wasn't just participating in basketball but owning it, something happened that would permanently alter the trajectory of the game. A single player emerged who didn't just dominate his competition, didn't just break records, but forced the sport itself to adapt just to remain functional. That player was Wilt Chamberlain, and what he did in the 1960s wasn't just greatness. It was a disruption so extreme that it exposed the limits of basketball as it was originally designed. To truly understand what Wilt represented, you have to detach yourself from modern expectations. Today's fans are used to elite athletes, to players who combine size, skill, and athleticism. But in Wilt's era, those traits were not supposed to coexist at that level. He stood over 7 feet tall at a time when that alone would have been enough to dominate, yet he moved with the speed and coordination of players much smaller than him. Before fully committing to basketball, he was an elite track and field athlete, excelling in sprinting, jumping, and even high-jump events. That background translated directly onto the court, where he didn't just tower over opponents, he overwhelmed them in motion, in strength, and in endurance. It wasn't just that he was better. It was that he didn't seem bound by the same physical limitations as everyone else. When teams in the NBA prepared to face Wilt, they weren't preparing for a game. They were preparing for damage control. Defensive schemes, which normally relied on positioning and teamwork, began to fall apart under the pressure of a player who could simply reach higher, move faster, and sustain effort longer than anyone tasked with guarding him. Double teams became routine, then triple teams, and eventually entire defensive strategies revolved around containing a single individual. And even then, containment was often the best-case scenario. Stopping him entirely was rarely realistic. Players would enter games knowing exactly what was about to happen, fully aware of the mismatch, and still be powerless to change the outcome. Then came the numbers, and this is where the story becomes almost difficult to process. In 1962, while playing for the Philadelphia Warriors, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a single game. Not in a fast-paced, three-point-heavy system like today's NBA, but in a far more physical and methodical version of the sport. Every possession required effort, every shot was contested, and yet somehow one player accounted for a number so high that it still stands as one of the most untouchable records in all of sports. There have been legendary scorers since, players capable of taking over games in spectacular fashion, but none have come remotely close to reaching that number under real conditions. And what makes it even more staggering is that this performance wasn't an isolated explosion. It was part of a broader pattern. That same season, Wilt averaged over 50 points per game, a statistical achievement so extreme that it almost feels fictional. But scoring was only part of the story. Wilt's control over the game extended into rebounding at a level that remains unmatched. He regularly pulled down more than 20 rebounds per game, sometimes far more, dominating possession in a way that fundamentally shifted the flow of competition. Every missed shot became an opportunity for him, and opponents quickly realized that even when they forced a bad attempt, the possession was far from over. Wilt's presence turned rebounds into inevitabilities rather than chances, creating a constant cycle of pressure that wore teams down both physically and mentally. At a certain point, it became clear that this wasn't just about one player being better than everyone else. It was about the structure of the game itself, struggling to contain him. The space near the basket, known as the paint, became Wilt's domain, an area where his combination of size and reach made scoring almost automatic. In response, the league made one of the most significant rule changes in its history. They widened the lane. By expanding the paint, they attempted to push Wilt further away from the rim, forcing him to operate in less advantageous positions. It was a fundamental alteration of the court's geometry, and while it applied to every player, its purpose was unmistakable. The game was adjusting to Wilt. Even the concept of free throws, one of the most standardized aspects of basketball, wasn't immune to his influence. Wilt demonstrated the ability to take off from behind the free throw line and finish with a dunk, effectively turning a routine scoring opportunity into something unstoppable. The league quickly intervened, reinforcing rules that required players to remain behind the line until the ball made contact with the rim. Once again, the adjustment wasn't theoretical. It was a direct response to something Wilt had already proven he could do. Despite all of this, Wilt continued to evolve. Critics began to question whether his style of play, heavily focused on scoring, translated into team success. Instead of ignoring those criticisms, he adapted. In a move that surprised many, Wilt shifted his approach and began emphasizing passing, eventually leading the league in assists during the 1967-68 season. It was a deliberate transformation, not a decline, and it demonstrated that his understanding of the game extended far beyond physical dominance. He wasn't just capable of controlling the game through scoring, he could orchestrate it entirely. And yet, for all his individual brilliance, Wilt's legacy is often framed through his rivalry with Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics. Russell's teams achieved extraordinary success, winning multiple championships through discipline, defense, and cohesion. Their matchups became a study in contrast. Wilt, the ultimate individual force, versus Russell, the embodiment of team-oriented basketball. While Russell often emerged victorious in terms of championships, even those victories existed in the shadow of Wilt's overwhelming presence. The rivalry wasn't just about wins and losses, it was about competing definitions of greatness. As basketball evolved, new generations of players brought new skills, new strategies, and new levels of athleticism. The game became faster, more spaced out, and more analytically driven. And yet, despite all of those advancements, Wilt's most extreme records remain untouched. Modern players benefit from superior training methods, nutrition, and global competition, but none have replicated the statistical dominance that Wilt achieved. Not because it's impossible in theory, but because the specific combination of circumstances, talent, and timing that defined Wilt's career has never existed again. There is also a broader context that often goes overlooked. Wilt played during a time of significant social change in the United States, a period where African-American athletes were gaining visibility and redefining their roles within professional sports. His presence, his confidence, and his dominance carried meaning beyond basketball, representing a shift in how athletes were perceived both on and off the court. He wasn't just dominating games, he was reshaping expectations. In the end, Wilt Chamberlain's story isn't just about records or achievements. It's about what happens when a sport encounters something it isn't prepared for. He didn't just succeed within the system. He revealed its limitations. The rules changed. The strategies evolved. The game itself adapted. And all of it traces back to one player who, for a brief moment in history, operated on a level that basketball simply wasn't ready to handle. And that is why, even decades later, his legacy feels different from everyone else's. Because Wilt Chamberlain wasn't just one of the greatest players ever. He was the moment when the game itself had to catch up.